Hi there, and welcome to episode 65 of B2B SaaS Marketing Snacks. I'm Brian Graff, I'm the CEO of Kalungi, and I'm here again with Kalungi's co-founder, Stein Hendricks, who's a serial SaaS marketing executive and ex-Microsoft product marketing leader. Today, we'll discuss some of the biggest and most prevalent issues that B2B SaaS marketing teams face on a daily basis. We'll cover problems with strategy, growth targets, messaging, and funnel focus, and we'll also discuss how we'd like to go about fixing problems in those areas. Hopefully this is helpful for founders and marketers alike as you use this to either identify and eliminate problems in your organization or avoid them altogether. Let's get into it. Welcome back, Stein. Thank you again for joining me. Today, I wanted to bring up a topic that we get to experience almost on a day-to-day level, or at least every time that we take on a new client. Definitely with Kalungi's work and also with the work that you do with your clients. Every client that we go into and company has their own special set of marketing issues, right? And some of those can be strategic issues, some of them can be team issues. But I wanted to take this episode and discuss a few of the themes that we've seen in a lot of our clients, some of the details behind them, and then some ideas in terms of what our audience can maybe do to avoid and or fix those issues with their marketing teams, right? And hopefully in doing so can help to unlock some new levels of performance that they haven't been able to achieve so far. So let's just start with, in your experience, what are some of the most common mistakes that you've seen at clients for B2B SaaS companies?
So the first kind of thing we always go to is, how big should your strategy be? Strategy versus technical execution is an interesting balance, right? Mm-hmm. We want to make sure that a company's moving their marketing investment in the right direction, right? The right audience, the right market, with the right value proposition, things like positioning. But you also can overdo that, right? At what moment have you theorized enough, and do you just want to get going and start building the ads and testing if the messaging works, right? And getting the creative out there and starting your campaigns and testing the different channels to reach your audience. So I think small companies sometimes have a hard time striking that balance, right? They either jump into execution blindly, and now they waste maybe a year in time and resources without really having thought about, how big should my market be? How do I make sure I'm relevant, right? How do I position myself versus the competition? And then you have sometimes companies that are a little bigger, let's say 10 million in ARR, that have an ability to actually really go beyond just optimizing their funnel, right? And just, getting their ads to run a little bit better, but really consider a new go-to-market opportunity that they haven't invested in yet, and they just don't take the time to think about it. They keep blindly executing the one thing that worked. And the book that I wrote, T2D3, is a little bit about that, right? When you get to that point, you've reached product market fit, let's say you have 8, 9, 10 million in ARR, optimizing that those one or two demand gen channels that work for you will only get you so much more growth, right? At some point, you got to diversify your demand gen. You got to go do revenue expansion per client and get your churn under control, all these other things. So I think between those two, figuring out when is your strategy too grand and you just got to go execute, and when do you need to actually make some bolder bets and not just execute. That's where I find most of the mistakes that we'll probably talk about in this episode derive from striking that balance as well.
Yeah, it's almost about right-sizing your go-to-market strategy and tactics to either your company maturity, your product maturity, or your marketing team maturity, right? There are plenty of early stage startups that have huge ideas on how they want to go to market, right? And even can bring in a fractional CMO that builds this amazing strategy, right? But the strategy needs to be supported by a 20-person marketing team that the startup can't afford, right? That doesn't help. Or it's that, what the go-to-market strategy that gets a company from 0 to 1 will not get them necessarily to 10, will not get them to 50, right? Plus. And so it is kind of constantly balancing the strategy that you build for the company that you're trying to support with it. And I think to your point, right, from that initial misalignment, there are plenty of other symptoms, I guess, that can come up right? With, targets not matching what your marketing team can produce to, having the wrong messaging or funnel focus or, not the right people in the right seats to support the strategy. But to your point, typically it does usually just start with the strategy. So maybe you touched on a little bit on kind of larger versus smaller companies, but is there anything else that you see that differs between, larger and smaller companies when these issues typically arise?
Well, if you're small, it's likely that your team they're either really good at execution or they have some real good strategic thinking, right? It's hard to find all the different skills you need in a small team. So when you're a little smaller, the more you can find like T-shaped marketers who can both execute well, but also understand how to think a little more long-term is really, really helpful. One of the tests I usually do when I'm involved in an early stage company, Brian, is I want to see if the team is able to write the whole positioning and the full kind of go-to-market strategy, turn it into a one-pager. A one-pager could be 2 pages, by the way. It could be the front and the back of a page. But to try to build both your positioning and your messaging, your value proposition, and sort of what's it for and kind of the who's it for, like making sure this is targeted at the right audience with the right, from visuals to voice, the right brand standards, all those things that go into making sure that you're both striking the right tone and looking bigger than you are, etc., for the audience that you're going after. If they can do that on a one page, then they're ready to execute, right, and to go optimize, etc. But if they're not, then you probably need to do a little more strategic work, right? Because unless you can produce that one pager, it's very hard to imagine that the ads are going to be very good, the events that are going to show up at are going to be managed well, or even the sales conversations are going to be good.
Yeah, I don't remember where I saw this, but there was a quote from Sam Altman that was saying that all of the most successful CEOs that he has ever met have been able to sum up their product and why it's important in about 25 words or less, right? And so if your executive team can't do that, right, how are you supposed to market that product? How are you supposed to communicate its value to prospects? I completely agree.
And a one-pager is kind of that, because you usually need about that type of length for your claim, what you do. Yep. That's like half a page. And then the first half page is like what you're solving, the problem, the market situation, the pain points, the customers that you're really and describing what they go through, right? And then you use if you get to the back of the page, you use that for some of your, testimonials, like proof points and things like that, right?
Yeah, but it is really, how can I concisely communicate this with some beautiful graphics, right? And good design behind it, but absolutely. I feel like I've seen in some of the smaller teams that I've worked with, there's usually there's usually a big resource gap, right? The go-to-market strategy that they want to put in place is probably a little bit too big for the resources that they have at hand, right? And there can be, especially with 0 to 1 startups, but even just 1 to 10 million ARR startups, right? The question is really, how can we prioritize the right go-to-market strategy, the small but very effective go-to-market strategy, right, with the limited resources that we have. But the plus side, right, is that usually the goals for startups in that stage are relatively simple, right? It's a revenue target that needs to get hit. It's one market that needs to be penetrated. It's one product that needs to be supported, right? So the nice thing is that it can be really a little bit more simple to align teams behind that goal. One of the things that I've seen with some of the larger companies is that, great, the budget increases, you can have better quote unquote teams that are either more talented on paper, right? Or you have more bodies in the room, which is good, right? But at the same time, this is when, diversification can be a double-edged sword, right? You need to diversify to increase revenue, whether that's your channels or the products that you bring to market or the markets that you play in, right? But doing so can really put a strain on marketing resources and prioritization and incentives within the team. So I typically have seen more misalignment in larger teams that can be harder to combat. Let's just start talking about strategy a little bit more. You mentioned that a lot of it just starts with almost biting off a little bit more than you can chew, right? But talk about, you mentioned quick wins and wasting a year there. Let's start there. Why do you think it is that it's so tempting for companies to favor execution, right? That blind execution. And then why do you think it is so critical to really take the time, as painful as it may be up front, to build the strategy before going hard into execution?
So Brian, what really is the problem there is that they have not maybe reached product market fit, right? Because if you've reached product market fit, you have proven that the problem you're solving is important for a certain amount of customers, right? And that they're willing to pay you, and they'll stay, right, etc. And if there's a desire to do more and more experimenting without really having a good ROI business case for those investments, it always makes me wonder, maybe we don't really have product market fit. We just had some lucky shots, right, with both our marketing efforts and maybe some sales heroism. That's really where I would take that. And when I hear CEOs or founders get excited about the lean startup method of quick experiments, that's of course fantastic if you have real short iterations where you're really learning something, right? You're having a product feature that you want to show to your customers and see if they like it, if they will use it. For that, these sprints is perfect, right? But you can't really sprint through doing account-based marketing because ABM will take 2-3 months before you basically build the good quality content that you need to have the high quality lists, fine-tune some of the messaging.
Not to mention the sales cycle.
Yeah, and then of course turning those into revenue is even harder, right? Leads is one thing, but then can you prove that this is actually becoming ARR is much harder. And then if you start those things that would take 2-3 months to really do well and learn from them, etc., and you cut the cord 3-4 weeks in, then of course you just wasted all that money and effort because now you didn't win, but you also didn't learn anything, so you lost.
Yeah, I like that. I think a lot of the companies that I talk to early on, right, before they engage Kalungi, all want that quick win, right? They all are ready. They're chomping at the bit to get revenue in the door, which I can understand, right? And they have burn rates that they need to consider, and they have expenses that they need to consider as well, right? And so it can be really tempting to say, hey, we just need to launch now and we'll figure it out later. But I think that the problem, and I think what you're talking about, is that we can't just launch and have that iterative testing go in place of a strategic hypothesis or knowledge of the market, right? What you're talking about is in that testing, we are doing it so that we learn about what the market wants and what our ICP wants and what they care about, in which case that's great and that's absolutely what you should do. But if you're doing it in terms of how can we A/B test, messaging or even like optimize ad campaigns, right? You're skipping a step almost, and you're going too far, and I think you will regret it. The irony of it is that building a marketing strategy takes, I don't know, a month, 2 months tops, and in the grand scheme of things is absolutely worth it, right? And so you'll actually end up generating much better results. But it does, you can't go straight into optimization and launch without that strategy in play.
And the reality, it doesn't need to take a month or two, right? It could take 2-3 weeks. If you actually really focus on deep discussions on what should really our ICP and our personas be, how do we position ourselves, putting it into a one-pager, doing some testing, talking with customers, doing some testimonial interviews, seeing if what you think they would say is actually what they will tell you. You can do that in a couple of weeks. Right, and that's better than just starting with all kinds of digital execution and hoping that you'll learn faster than you'll run out of money.
It's a dangerous game. Okay, so on that note, actually, that's a perfect segue. How important would you say that customer communication and feedback is in building that strategy?
Yeah, I always like to start with positioning and ICP assumptions from the team, and ideally a lot of the customer-facing team members, right, for them to tell you, hey, these are the customers that it's easier for us to sell to, right? These are the ones that when we have them on the phone in the customer success team that are most happy, and they see the value, and especially if you can let them ask, hey, why is this important for you? Why do you see the value, right? Then you can get gold. And then, of course, you use some data, right? Which of these customers are, having higher MRR, right? And better churn levels and all those things. But then you put all that stuff into kind of a thesis, right? This is my ICP, this is my positioning. And you test it. You do customer testimonial interviews with your existing customers, and you kind of confirm that some of your assumptions are holding true. And then you also test it with your pipeline. You kind of see, hey, what's coming in that's converting a little easier. Does that confirm that the ICP we're going to select is the lower friction sale, right? Is the better fit? So I think you need to really do, that's the experiment that you do have to run, and you can do that in a relatively short time frame.
Just one thing to keep in mind, right, is that you just can't build your strategy in a room, right? You can't get into a meeting and build the entire strategy without going out and talking to the customers in some form or fashion, right? So doing that to get a direction is fantastic, right? But then it absolutely needs to be validated in the market, like you're saying.
Yeah, the problem, you always have the salespeople that are going to be, if they provide the input, who are, of course, the closest to the actual prospects and what they ask for. But they're going to give you input that's sometimes a little bit too, I guess, careful or not bold enough. But then the product people or the founder might be a little too bold, right? And everybody will love this thing that we built, right?
And that's a whole other can of worms as well, is right, making sure that the feedback that is given from customers makes it to all the teams, right? It's not only, it's great if it influences marketing messaging, but if marketing's going to market with a message that doesn't match the one that sales gives, or even the one that the capabilities of the product, right, then you're in a world of hurt. So that's another great point as well. So let's talk about messaging now. You mentioned the one pager earlier. What do you think are some of the biggest issues with companies building the right messaging that will ultimately convert, right? And really, messaging is at the core of every single ad campaign, every single go-to-market motion, right? And so it's critical that you get it right. But what would you say are some of the biggest issues with messaging that you've come across in new clients, and how have you worked with them to fix it?
Yeah, it's very hard for an early stage company to not talk about themselves, right? You feel that you have so much work to do to drive awareness, to get people to even know about your great solution. And so you end up falling in the trap of talking about your features, your capabilities, why you're the best thing since sliced bread. And that is, of course, fantastic if you're testing if people actually mind, if they even care. But that's not really what you're trying to do. You're first trying to get them to even listen to you, right? To look up. So the biggest messaging issue is really we have a framework we call pain, claim, gain, right? To not talk about them in the form of their pains, what's relevant for your audience first, before you try to talk about what you're doing to solve that, right? And the claims. And then, of course, you always close with the gain, which is what do people now miss out on if they don't end up buying your product, right? Pain, claim, gain, it basically is answering the question, why should you care, and why, about your company, and then why now. And every early stage company that I'm interacting with, Brian, doesn't do this well. So it's kind of the most easy, quick win. If you can even improve that like a little bit, it will go a long way.
I think that's a fantastic piece. I think the other piece that I've seen and that will add in or will contribute to the next topic as well, but is just adding real value to prospects and customers throughout the customer journey, right? I think that there are plenty of companies, startups who don't know marketing maybe. They're more product focused or something like that. And they will just say like, we just need to make content, right? Because that's what marketing is and that's what marketing does, but they don't think about how can we really add value in that content? How can we answer real questions that our prospects have? How can we help them with their jobs to be done? How can we establish ourselves as a real authority in the space? And without asking those questions, finding the answers to those, the content can come across as very generic, right? The value propositions can be weak, and it can be very difficult to, you'll run all the right campaigns on all the right channels, right? And they won't convert because the content and the value propositions just aren't there. So I think combining that with what you're saying of, you need to pull somebody out of stasis, stand out from the noise, convince them to even look at you, right? And then have those those value propositions and that content that really adds value will go a long way in that.
Yeah, and now at the age of AI, right, all the messaging will get even more vanilla, or it's already. Like today, a salesperson showed me a demo of one of those list building tools, Zoom Info, that allows you now to immediately, when you're working on the list, you figure out who you want to contact, to immediately write the email. All these things that you could do in ChatGPT, but it's completely integrated.
Yep.
And it is so vanilla. So we were talking about, okay, there's probably 5 people who look at the same Zoom Info record, the same individual, and they click on that button, like generate the email, and they got 5 similar emails, right? And all going to that same person. Mm-hmm. So this is where, when you do this well, you really understand what your customers are looking for, what they're going through, and you can talk to them like nobody else can because you know them so well. That's how you can really stand out. AI cannot replace that anytime soon.
We got to have a whole separate episode on that that will come to you in one of these weeks. But yeah, I couldn't agree more. And then quickly, I guess let's jump into more tactics, right? Like, let's say that the strategy's built and built well. One of the things that I've seen has been funnel focus being an issue amongst, like, between the marketing team and, say, executives, right? Where it could be partially executives wanting quick wins, but what's interesting is that in the notes, I feel like you're saying that marketers tend to focus more on the top of funnel, right, than the bottom. And I actually, in my experience, have seen executives want marketing to focus more on the bottom than the top. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on that. So in your experience, you've seen kind of more kind of fluffy top of funnel campaigns that don't add any value, or what are you seeing?
So what you sometimes encounter, you're in an environment where there's maybe a sales leader or there's a CEO who answers every idea that the team comes up with, or every question they ask, or when they have a need or they have a resource request, with, okay, how many leads will this add to the funnel?
Yep.
Right? Or how much value will it add to the funnel? Mm-hmm. And the problem with that is that it's not necessarily an unfair question, right? It's, of course, when you're the business owner, it's totally fine to say, hey, what's the bottom line impact here, right? And why should we do this?
Yep.
But it can easily kind of, because it's so hard sometimes to connect the dots of a very specific thing you want to test, you want to try, like, hey, is this persona going to be interested in what we have to offer? Okay, is that going to yield us 12 leads next week? No, but we still need to know that, because otherwise we're not going to build content for this persona, et cetera, et cetera. So you got to just be careful with funnel focus, that it doesn't become such an artificial, oh, let me show how much I care about the business, and it shuts down kind of any attempt to build some foundational insights or materials.
Right.
That's, I think, where I sometimes see it get a little bit overused. And it doesn't mean that you can't always ask yourself, hey, how is this going to impact whatever leading metric we can define that will impact, of course, the business, right?
Yeah, I think that's fair. And I think we're actually pretty aligned on that. I think what I've seen is, I have seen a lot of what you just said, right? Of the CEOs and executives saying, okay, show me how this is going to impact pipeline, right? With every single channel. And that, to your point, right, is not necessarily... That thinking won't get you very far with marketing, right? It will work with 1 or 2 channels, but it will keep you in a purely, we like to call it demand capture mode, right? Where you're really only focusing on a small portion of the market that's actively searching for your product. It won't allow you to capture or to start to convert those that aren't looking for your product yet, right? And so my recommendation for something like this is to, hey, you got to map out your customer journey from start to finish, right? And you really need to start building content and campaigns for the entire journey. And almost as a marketing leader, I would almost require that part of my budget and part of a portion of our campaigns are focused on the top of funnel, purely focused on the top of funnel with minimal attribution, right? Like, say, a podcast, for example, to use this, right? You're not going to get any attribution out of it aside from downloads and a kind of a vague indicator of traction, but you're not going to, it will be few and far between the indicators that you can see where you can actually attribute it to revenue. And of course you can put a how did you hear us about us on the forum, but you're doing it because you want to establish yourself as a thought leader, you want to join the conversation, and you want to add real value with zero friction to people, right? So that when they start thinking about considering a purchase or a solution, you are the one that comes up.
And what really helps is that you then actually start measuring whatever those things are on a very regular, like weekly basis, right? Just like if you build a product, software product, you're not going to measure how many products an individual developer ships, right? But you can measure how much code they check in, right? And how many bugs they fix.
Yep, absolutely. And yeah, I guess the last thing on that is just because you don't have as many measurements or KPIs that you can track on those things does not mean that they, the pressure isn't on to ship on time and at a good cadence and really high quality content, right? That absolutely needs to happen. But you just can't tie everything to revenue. It's a broader picture, and marketing, especially marketing today with so much noise in the market and within the competition, right? You need so many different touch points on a customer journey to be effective. And so you have to, you have to build out that top of funnel, more brand awareness content to be successful.
Cool.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Thank you to Adriano Valerio for producing this episode and the Kalungi team for helping us make this whole thing work. And of course, you for choosing to spend your time with us. As a reminder, all the links we mentioned in this episode can be found in the show notes. And if you want to submit or vote on a question you'd like us to answer, you can do that at kalungi.com/podcast. Every time we record, we take one of the top 3 topics and jam on it. Thanks again.